This week in painting class, we looked at clouds, the idea of painting clouds. And I want to talk about several different aspects of just that proposition of focusing on painting clouds, but also what they might bring up in terms of modes of representation or how we represent things as humans with images. And so what came out of that was the idea of putting a photograph of a cloud next to a painting of a cloud next to something like a Mario Kart or a Super Mario depiction of a cloud. And several things came up in the class. We ended up doing ground. We painted a ground first and painted on top. We did wet on wet, and started to talk about illusion because clouds tend to bring up the imagination and the idea of what is a successful cloud. So if we look at these three images, how are they different? How do they talk about cloud differently, or a culture or a civilization's relationship to clouds differently? So in the bottom left is kind of our star of the show, and I have several slides of John Constable from the early 1800s, the kind of beginning of the tradition of painting impressions outside and bringing them back inside to share and paying attention. He's part of this history of landscape painting, of a theme in Western European painting tradition, of a theme of a fleeting moment, whether it's a pear on a table or the back of alleyway of a house, like something like Corot. In Constable's case, we have this icon, kind of this moment of shifting the attention of the painting from a famous piece of architecture or a king or a historical narrative or an allegory to something that is kind of a happenstance, or that might lack historical importance, of just somebody outside witnessing a moment in time coming in on the wind or in the air, and trying to pin that down perhaps, or make a container for it. So that's a beautiful human idea, and he kind of represents that. Whereas up here we have a photograph from the 21st century, and then of course we have this infamous Mario Kart, Mario Cloud. And so what comes up when we start to talk about a class devoted to painting clouds, laced into that is the idea that we might learn different ways of painting for different objects or different things or different motifs, as if there might be a different way to approach painting trees or interiors or grass or a table versus clouds and landscape. And that is not as obvious as it may seem at first. The history of the pedagogy, of the teaching of painting, has been quite wrapped up in kind of treating everything the same, maybe, or treating every square inch of a surface with the same amount of density of intention. For example, something like Mondrian on the right, the abstract painter. I think this is when he was in New York in the 20th century, and we have abstraction and this idea that the entire surface is kind of given the same weight of attention, um, not only maybe in looking and attention, but also maybe in the amount that it's touched or that it's built upon. And around the time of Ab X, figures like Philip Guston, de Kooning, dredged, these modernist icons dredged earlier art history for for moments that maybe talked about shape and form, kind of making the picture plane into a puzzle where it all kind of fits together or locks in. So in the case of Philip Guston, he's dredging history for for some of that, and he finds Piero della Francesca from the 1400s, one of the the original inventors of perspective with Alberti, and this is one of his frescoes, where we can kind of see it as shapes of a puzzle where the flatness of the picture plane perhaps is highlighted. That's one way of seeing this kind of frieze narrative. Someone like Henry Moore, uh, the sculptor, dredging Mesoamerica for what he found was important to his time period. So we have this kind of game of telephone, right? Where different moments in history are recalibrating and finding previous moments in history, uh, and re kind of negotiating those time periods for what's important to their time period. So you kind of have this Rubik's cube of history happening, and that comes up when we think about a class about painting clouds, because that moment in the Western tradition, I think of Delacroix as kind of a pivotal moment in that. If you, I read his diaries at one point, and Van Gogh's diaries, and kind of in combination, there's these moments where Delacroix is able to kind of fixate in a specific spot in the painting, maybe paint the hem of a dress for a period of time in his studio, that that in some ways of teaching or traditions wouldn't be conducive, because you kind of would hopscotch back and forth all over the picture, and the picture is kind of coalescing at one time. So this idea of getting lost in one place of attention and treating it differently um, might be suspect to certain modernist principles. But in the case of someone like Zurbarán or Velázquez or these great Spanish painters, there seems to be a moment where the glass is treated differently, or the fabric is treated differently. And so the minute we start talking about painting clouds, that comes to bear, right? Like, do you want to treat clouds differently than hair, or is it just a moment of light um, that can be abstracted to the metaphor, to some kind of metaphorical language of paint? So in the case of Delacroix, if we look at all, this has all been painted, it's all been touched, but perhaps the sky and the hillside kind of dissipates, both in terms of its impasto or its thickness of texture. Maybe it's given attention, but it's not as emphatic, perhaps, as we might think of someone like Piero or Mondrian. So you could look at the narrative of representation in this way. Um, so if we go back to our original slide, so I just kind of broke down this idea of landscape painting and the momentary fleeting moment and the kind of plein air idea of Constable in England, who's often paired with Turner and the sublime and storms. And now if we move to clouds in terms of maybe a more modern notion, we have someone like Corey Archangel, which, if you haven't seen this video, it's worth looking at, where he took Mario. This was in the Whitney Biennial in 2004, I think. And he took out all of the game, and the cloud is just kind of dancing across the screen the way it would in the game, but with the absence of the game. I thought it was just a fun thing to pair against the more romantic notion that we're dealing with Constable. Here are some more examples of Constable's plein air paintings. I think clouds are an excellent place to think about a stereotypical cloud. And when we're dealing with painting, we're often dealing with averaging what we're looking at, because it's a question of codifying many kind of moments of information, right? Of light bouncing all over our Earth, and a cloud offers an opportunity, especially a landscape, to say, well, all of this dark, I'm just going to say, is one color. Right? It's not like every little pixel or square is treated with a different color, but an averaging occurs. And in our mind's eye, when we imagine a cloud, it's easy maybe to imagine kind of a fluffy cloud, and that is a form of averaging, of distilling uh, an experience or an object down to some kind of icon, such as this cloud. So these are different ways of kind of stereotyping or modeling a cloud in terms of an image. And something like a cartoon is a great place to deal with that. And how does that interact with kind of your memory of a cloud, maybe, or your imagination of a cloud? And then in this conversation, what I'm throwing up in the air, right, is the idea of the canon, or high art and low art, or these terms to talk about kind of how profound or how meaningful or how necessary art is, maybe. And so, and for what purpose. And when we get into cartoons or images, they're distilled in that way, in a graphic way, we can start to think about that a little bit. These clouds are surprisingly accurate in terms of a particular type of cloud. I was surprised. In my memory, I thought that cartoons all had kind of the classic fluffy cloud that I see in something like a Mario. But actually, going through the images, a lot of the like Wile E. Coyote clouds are quite hazy. So here's a juxtaposition of kind of a hazy cartoon cloud on the left next to a storm by Turner, by John Constable in England. So let's just kind of, I'll go through these slides quite quickly. Of these are quite small. They're like 12 by 6, 12 by 11, 12 by 10, painted oil on paper often, and then the paper is laid on a panel. And these are totems, really, in the kind of history for me of landscape painting. This is an example of a peach ground. We tried two different colored grounds and then painting on top, both with dark and light. And that's a wonderful experience to realize that you can carve away from the surface with dark. That's kind of our normal inclination with writing. You write a word that's dark on a light ground, but to realize that you could cover the ground with charcoal and erase, that erasing is a mark. And that tends to become apparent if you have a valued ground or colored ground that you can take away and add as a way of forming a representation. One beautiful idea that they came up in talking about Constable and clouds was the idea of what's a successful cloud painting. And Constable was interested in science and rational thought in a way, and had notes about very specific qualities of clouds, and was interested in the classification of them. And what came up was the idea maybe a successful cloud is one that you can dream about being something other than what it is, right? That you can make things up in. I think that's a fun idea, is that a successful representation of a thing is something that you might see animals in, or trees in, or shapes in. On the right, you have uh, Constable's kind of more um, kind of bigger projects of these paintings with architecture embedded in them, the landscape with an architecture form embedded. One thing I want to highlight is that this is something that humans have the ability to do, is quite special, quite beautiful, to be able to average. You have to average, right? Because the clouds are constantly moving, and this is a snapshot, but a snapshot that's made sequentially on one surface. And the constable using his memory to come up with something that is digestible as a single form that represents a cumulus cloud, or some lenticularis, or some very specific form of of storm pattern or weather pattern. this one on the right came up in class because a student used two blues at the end of class, and the idea is like maybe there's a Prussian blue on the bottom and ultramarine on the top. Um, we haven't gotten into mixing grays that much, but these are wonderful kind of ways of looking at mixing grays. I guess the last thing to say is that maybe in a quick glance at one of these paintings, it might just look like some smudges. The fact that it can become something worth looking at, yeah, that is part of the proposition of the meaning of some of the pieces. The one on the right feels more composed, maybe, but on the left we have something that's kind of a could could be thought of as thrown off, a cast off, but that with some consideration, we start to see so much in it. The light passing through here on the bottom right, or the slightly darker blue underneath this purple. There's a way where clouds offer up a, a certain abstract quality of uh, of the viewer interacting or kind of assembling it into a sky or a particular moment, particular time of day.